Hello and welcome to the Enterprise Talk Conversation Series, a peer knowledge resource by the CXOs for the CXOs. Now to our host, Kanika Goswami.
Hi, we welcome you to a podcast on stage with enterprise thought leaders. My name is Kanika Goswami and I'm the managing editor of OnDot Media's B2B enterprise technology publications. We have engaging conversations with global thought leaders and industry experts, which reach over 1.3 million business leaders worldwide. Today we have with us one such business leader, Richard Hummel. He's a threat intelligence lead for NETSCOUT. Hi, Richard. Welcome to our podcast today.
Hi, Kanika. Nice to be here, and thank you for having me. Excited to talk about what we have today.
Oh, it's a pleasure to have you. A little bit of your introduction for the sake of the audience. Richard has over 14 years of experience in the intelligence field and is currently the threat intelligence lead for NETSCOUT's Assert team. Previously, he served as a manager and principal analyst at FireEye and Eyesight Partners. He began his career as a signals intelligence analyst with the United States Army. Oh, this is interesting. During the course of his service, he became certified in digital network intelligence and supported multiple operations overseas, including a deployment to Iraq. Richard holds a Master of Science degree in Information Security Engineering with the SANS Technical Institute, which he uses to lead a team focused on analyzing the DDoS threat landscape. We'll be speaking about this today as well, right? So
Excellent.
His duties involve mentoring and leading a diverse team of senior and junior researchers performing big data analytics, machine learning and threat analysis across a collection of global data to unearth adversary activities for the purpose of better protecting customers from worldwide threats. Is there anything we missed, Richard?
No, I think that's enough talking about me. So let's get into it.
So can we hear something about NETSCOUT from you?
Yes, absolutely. So NETSCOUT is, well, first and foremost, we're a service assurance and a security company. Our goal in life is to make sure that our customers have the visibility and the always-on aspect of their networks. Our goal is that we want to prevent any adversary who wants to take down a network for any reason. But we also want to give our customers a view into that network, because if you can see into the deepest parts of your network, one, troubleshooting just is super easy. Two, it's easier to secure. And then three, you can have confidence about what we're doing to help secure you. And so ultimately, what we want to do is make sure that we have that visibility, make sure we have that security of those networks. And so we have a whole slew of security products designed for that. My team doesn't really focus on product per se. We focus on the threat landscape. What are we doing in terms of tracking the adversary, tracking the various threats that are out there? And that informs what we do in NETSCOUT wide with our products. If we see an adversary using a new methodology or a new attack type, then that tells us, hey, you know what, do we have coverage for that in our product? If not, well, let's design something that will give us that coverage. And so the threat intelligence really is a companion part of everything that we do here at NETSCOUT.
So my first question to you is, what is the current state of the threat landscape, including the rise of DDoS hacktivist groups? Given the political situation across the world, it's just blowing up. So
yes,
your comments on that.
So a little bit of background, I guess, historically speaking, when it comes to DDoS attacks or cyber attacks in general, as it relates to politics or geopolitical conflicts or issues, religious or otherwise, they've always been there, right? These have gone all the way back. I mean, I could go back decades and I could point out instances of, hey, they attacked because of this, or somebody said this and they did that, or there's this thing that somebody doesn't agree with, and so maybe Anonymous, like the old school Anonymous, launched an attack, right? You could go back and you could trace these. It wasn't really until recently that things changed in a major way. And I'm not going to say that hacktivists haven't always existed. In fact, they did. When I was working at FireEye, we used to have a DDoS product focused on hacktivism. There was quite a bit of it then, but nowhere near the scale of which we're dealing with today. And even then, they were minor nuisances. Like, okay, there was a group out here that do these things, but hacktivism was largely defacing a website. Oh, I got access to your public website. I'm going to put my name on it because people are going to see it when they come visit it, right? That was a lot of the extent of what they were doing for hacktivism. DDoS attacks were a thing, but the tooling, the capabilities, the resources weren't where they are at today. Over the years, you can go back to events like Armada Collective, a big campaign group that launched some campaigns. You have Operation Ababil, which was targeting financial services. You have Lizard Squad that was out there launching DDoS attacks. You have some of that tied to maybe the Olympics of the past. Rio Olympics were attacked with DDoS. So there's different things that have happened over time. But what really changed really started when Russia invaded Ukraine. And I'm not saying that was the catalyst where all of a sudden these guys came out of nowhere. I think they were maybe always there, but they didn't have a concentrated agenda. They didn't have this camaraderie that brought them all together to really like kick things into high gear. And so what we saw when Russia invaded Ukraine was a significant spike in DDoS attacks against public resources. So media websites were attacked, financial services were attacked, service providers were attacked. And the DDoS attacks were effective in some cases because some of these organizations didn't realize that they would ever be the target of a DDoS attack. And so they weren't ready or prepared to handle some of these things. So you get protected. But then that little bit of success was enough for some of these adversaries to say, hey, this works. It was a scare tactic, right? We're under assault. All of these people are coming at us. Now, what was happening during that time period was there was other attacks that were invisible to the end user that were happening. There was compromises, there was brute forcing, there was exploitation, there was other things happening. But what got surfaced, what was visible to the audience was the DDoS attacks. They're very powerful, they're very widespread, they make a splash, they cause mayhem, essentially. And so that started this weird, crazy domino effect of just hundreds, if not thousands, of individuals under the umbrella of what was then KillNet, now starting to splinter and fraction into all these other cells. So you have KillNet, then you have Anonymous Sudan that comes out of that. You have No Name 57 that comes out of that. Now you've got Cyber Team Russia, you've got Team Bangladesh, you have Anonymous Russia, you have all of these different splinter cells, hacktivists. And if you were to look at Telegram channels where these guys boast and they talk about their attacks, over the past year, there has been 1,200 or more different names of different groups with different agendas launching these kind of DDoS hacktivist attacks. That's a lot of groups. I can't point to any one time in the past prior to this that we would ever see so many active groups at any one time. It's typically a few here and there. But now we're talking about multiple groups that are really prolific, all operating at the same time. So now you started with that, and you saw both of the countries, Russia and Ukraine, were getting hammered on both sides of the aisle. And then that started to extend to, well, anybody supporting Ukraine is going to get attacked. Well, anybody supporting Russia is going to get attacked. And so now you have this kind of back and forth where you have all these different groups just throwing network traffic all over the place. And so now it's become this scapegoat. Anytime there is a public statement, anytime there's a public sentiment out there. I published a blog recently about Poland where the new prime minister was elected. And literally the day he was elected, DDoS attacks surged. So there's a few things. One, he made a public statement saying we're not doing enough to support Ukraine. Two, he tore down the entire public media or the government-run media that they had to rebuild it. He had previously made inflammatory statements against religious organizations that he didn't agree with, and immigration and various other things. And so they got hammered, right, big time. Same thing is happening in Sweden. Same thing is happening in France. It's happened previously with NATO-aligned countries. Finland, when they joined NATO, happened there. Sweden, they're joining NATO. And literally the day that the foreign minister of Sweden says that, hey, Turkey agreed to this and Hungary is about to ratify, guess what? We saw another spike of DDoS attacks. And so now it's just become this weird, like anytime there's this major event or outspoken thing where you go public on record, you're going to paint yourself as a target, whether you're a country, your organization, the industry that you work in. And so that's really, from a geopolitical standpoint, that's what we're dealing with now in the DDoS space. So I can literally look at the telemetry I have of DDoS attacks and put fingers on what might be political statements made or what might be major moves happening around the world. And then when I go to Google and say, hey, what happened in this country on this day? Sure enough, now there's some political statement that was said. So it's really intriguing, but it's also quite frightening when you think about it at the scale of which we're dealing with.
So this was about the geopolitical risks that countries or people in power take. Are there any other trending types of DDoS hacktivist groups which are not associated with the political situations, you think?
Not that I'm tracking at this time. Most of the hacktivism that we're seeing is very much tied to major events, geopolitical conflicts, engaging in various boots on ground type of conflicts, religious conversations. I suspect with the Olympics coming up, with US based elections coming up, we're going to keep our ear to the ground to see what happens there. We have had past elections that are not necessarily there's a major conflict or anything. It could be just opposing parties. There's been smaller countries where the users want to vote, but they watch the polling sites to see who's winning, to see where to cast their votes, because they might have ongoing polling as voting is still open. And so there's been opposing parties that would attack the other party so that those polls disappear, and then nobody knows where to cast their votes. So we've seen stuff like that in the past. The other really big facet of DDoS attacks outside of the geopolitical space is really just end users targeting end users. So there's a lot of this in the gaming and gambling industry where you have a bunch of users out there that are playing online games and they don't like their opponent, or they want to take down their server, or maybe they're competing. Maybe there's not even any money on the line, but they just want to win. It's super accessible and super easy now to launch DDoS attacks. That why not? I'm talking to my opponent via VoIP communications. I know what their IP address is, so let me just go put their IP address in this tool and push a button. And now all of a sudden they can launch these attacks. And so that's a huge part of the global DDoS attacks is in that space. So user on user targeting. The second most impactful would be in this geopolitical realm.
Yeah, that was what I wanted to know. So what can organizations do to defend themselves and keep their networks safe? Very little when it comes to socio-political attacks because they're targeted at certain ideologies, if not
Certainly.
organizations. But as far as enterprises go, how do they keep themselves safe?
I think the main thing is just ensure you have some form of protection. So across the board, when I think about whether it's end users and they have an agenda, or it's students attacking the school because they don't want to go to school or they don't want to take a test or whatever it might be, even the hacktivists, a large portion of hacktivists out there, they'll use common DDoS attack vectors that have been around for decades. They'll use DDoS for hire platforms that have all of these attacks are known. They're not new, they're not novel, they're not significant. Maybe they have a lot of resources so they can get pretty large, but they're known entities. It's very few and far between that an adversary comes along and does something completely novel. And if you happen to be the target of something that's completely novel, there are ways around that as well. There's ways to handle those, but the vast majority, 99% of all DDoS attacks out there are known. They're just launched in different ways, or they're launched against organizations that don't have preparations in place, or maybe you have a solution in place, but you haven't done real world testing. You haven't done any wargaming. You haven't done any red teaming to ensure that you can handle that. Your SOC team, like the product is deployed, but your SOC team has never had training on it. Or you've never really had a real world event to test yourself on. And so that typically is what happens when we see this outage or that outage. Either they didn't have something in place, they had something and it wasn't configured properly, they had it in place, it was configured, but they didn't have any expertise on site to be able to handle things as they changed over time. And so to me, preparation is the single biggest factor and will solve 80 to 90% of all of the problems in the DDoS space. Being prepared, understanding that you can be and you will be the target of one of these at some point in time, and you've solved most of your battle. And so to me, that's the biggest advice I would give to any enterprise, service provider, anyone out there with regards to DDoS attacks.
And this is a slightly different, slightly digressing question. AI tools can preempt and predict attacks given patterns, right? So how
Yes.
far do you think they're effective?
I think it's super effective. Let me just give you a couple of examples. So when we go and we look at the threat landscape, we're doing a number of things. One is we look at the telemetry that we're getting from all of our collections. We're looking at global honeypots that we operate and manage. We have our own global scanner where we look for devices that an adversary can abuse. And so what we'll do is we don't just take the collective totality of all of that. If we did, I mean, we're talking like hundreds of millions of IP addresses. There's not a device on the planet that can upload all of those IP addresses to block. And you wouldn't want to, because most of the time, these are legitimate devices, home computers, home routers, your Fitbit that's connected to your Wi-Fi, right? We don't want to just block all these devices because then things stop working. What you want to block is the malicious activity that could emanate from those. And so typically what we'll do is we'll identify all of these, but we will specifically use the telemetry that we have built over decades to say which ones are active, which ones are adversaries using to launch those DDoS attacks. Those are the things we care about. And so the first bit of that is reactive, right? We have to actually see the adversary use it. So there's always going to be some reactivity here in the DDoS space. But it's also predictive, because what happens is an adversary will go out there, they'll find this infrastructure they're going to abuse. They don't just use it once and move on. Most of the time, they will buy a pool of them. They'll buy 50,000 here, or they'll buy 100,000 here, and they'll just use them over and over and over again. And the person who sold those probably didn't just sell it to that one adversary, they sold it to a number of them, because there's hundreds of these services in the underground. And so there's a high degree of reuse for a lot of this infrastructure. And so by observing it even once, it allows it to get into threat intelligence that we can then predict will be used again. And what we have found for a lot of the infrastructure for these services is that that infrastructure is used again and again and again for up to a month and a half before it goes away. And so yes, you can. Now, can anybody do this? No, I don't think so. You really have to have a global view in collections like what we have over decades in order to see this. Because otherwise you're looking at a slice of the pie. Maybe you have, I don't know, maybe you're an enterprise-focused organization, you collect this information, that's great. What about the 80% of the DDoS landscape that is not targeted at the enterprise, but is targeted at end users on broadband access networks? You would never see those attacks, you would never see that infrastructure, you would never know that you needed to block that. You might be really good about blocking for the enterprise and specific threats against the enterprise. But what happens when a new batch of these IP addresses are sold that somebody now uses to target the enterprise instead of the broadband access user? Well, you've never seen those. You haven't predicted that. And so the global visibility that we get sitting in all these different places, enterprises and service provider networks and ASPs and mobile and satellite and so on and so forth, it gives that really comprehensive picture that it doesn't matter where the infrastructure is, doesn't matter who the target is, we're going to understand and know when that happens and create this predictive intelligence.
Right. Are there any specific industries you see that are under more attack than the others? Is there any such pattern that you have discovered?
There are definitely some patterns, but what I will say is this, is while there are patterns, often it's not necessarily that one industry is attacked more than another. It might be that different threats go against different industries. So let me outline this for you a little bit. In the next threat report that we publish on April 25th, you're going to find on the web form version, there's a section in there where we talk about enterprise threats. And on there, we have an interactive graph, and I don't know why it's giving me a thumbs up on a Zoom, but it is. There's an interactive graph in there that lets you select from like 12 or 13 different industries. Now, what you're going to find on there is that the threats each of these face changes. So if I were to look at, let's just say media publishing, because I'm talking to, media types here. If I look at media publishing across all of the enterprises that we're looking at, now again, this is sampled. We're not talking about every single one of our customers, but sampled data. The number one threat against media organizations is volumetric DDoS attacks, reflection amplification. These are the things that have been around for decades and decades. We know about these things. So why is reflection amplification against enterprises in media the number one threat? Because typically enterprises, they get reflection amplification, but it's usually not the number one threat. So why in the media space is it? Well, let me lay it out. So for a lot of these hacktivists, what did I mention earlier about the first attacks against Ukraine? Media websites, right? Now, Anonymous Sudan, they use DDoS for hire services to do this. The types of attacks you launch from those services are reflection amplification. And so what you're going to see is the type of adversary and the type of attack often dictate what industry is getting attacked. Now, if I were to change this, and I have the graph here. I'm not going to share my screen, but I have it here in front of me. So I'm going to change to, let's do higher education. So if I change to higher education, which is going to be like your professional schools and your universities and things like that, the number one threat they face, DDoS botnets, not reflection amplification. In fact, reflection amplification is number 3. The first thing is DDoS botnets, followed by brute forcing, and very quickly in third or fourth is exploitation. So botnet attacks are going to be establishing a series of nodes that are compromised that can then launch different kinds of attacks. And because brute forcing and exploitation come in as a quick third and fourth, my understanding of this is the DDoS botnets themselves are both launching DDoS attacks, and they are trying to propagate, and they are trying to exploit. And so that's what's impacting higher education. That could be a more sophisticated adversary that could be a precursor to, say, ransomware or data exfiltration or something else to that effect. So a completely different perspective on a different industry with different threats. And I could go through the 13 or 14 different industries listed here, and you'll see that graph change all over the place. If I look at government, proxy-based attacks, application layer stuff, layer 7, going after websites and going after other kinds of services like that, are spiking like crazy, like no other industry. And so you just see how there's different adversaries using different tools to attack different industries. And it's kind of cool to see it from that perspective.
This would make for a very interesting discussion, which is, just by itself, instead
Absolutely.
of talking about what is the sophistication gap in a DDoS attack?
I would say that the vast majority of DDoS attacks are not sophisticated in any way. If I had to put, let's just think in recent terms. If I'm looking at a lot of the adversaries that are out there or a lot of the DDoS attacks occurring, there's 2 groups that I would put these in. One is tried and true, right? You're using the same things that everybody's been using time and time again. You haven't changed it. Your infrastructure remains the same. Your tools remain the same. The attack types remain the same. And then you have the more sophisticated adversary that is intentionally trying to cause harm from a deep-seated belief or an agenda that is backing something prolific. So No Name 57 comes to mind in this case. They have done something different that we've not seen in the DDoS space before. They actually gamify how they launch DDoS attacks. And so what they have done is they designed this customized malware code called DDoS. Now, it's just a script you can deploy on any kind of system. I think it's written in Go language. And what they've done is told the underground that, hey, you know what you can do is you can go and spin up a server, a device, something somewhere, deploy our code, and then give us access to it. And the more DDoS attacks we can launch from your infrastructure you set up, the more points you get. And whoever is at the top of our leaderboard is going to get this custom currency that we've designed so you can make purchases in the underground, or you can do something with that currency. And so what they've done is they've basically told all of these would-be operators that there is incentive for them to do these things. And so now what we find is the operators are going to find infrastructure that is highly resilient and also at first glance trustworthy. And so the 2 places where we see them deploying this code is bulletproof hosting providers. These are providers that don't listen to takedown attempts. They're very resilient. They don't go away. They let their users do whatever they want on it. And then also public cloud hosting. So think of all of the public cloud hosting out there. I mean, typically, even ourselves, we were guilty of this for a time. If something was coming from a specific cloud hosting provider, we would just implicitly trust that. Not necessarily for our networks, but we would basically use that as a criteria to say, is this malicious or not? But these adversaries realize that if we host stuff there, we can probably launch a series of attacks before it gets detected and before it gets taken down. And if there's any other organizations out there that are implicitly trusting some of these cloud hosting providers, guess what? We have succeeded in passing our first layer of security defense. And so this is what we're seeing from no name. So to me, that's a much more sophisticated approach than what we've seen in the past. And so there definitely is different camps of sophistication here in the DDoS space, but by and large, it's the same stuff we've been seeing for decades.
My last question is, Richard, what is your view on the increasingly utilized DDoS attacks methods such as carpet bombing and DNS water torture attacks? I am not aware of what water torture attacks are.
Yeah, let me explain those. I'll explain it for you here quickly. So we'll start with carpet bombing since that was the first one. So carpet bombing is an adversary says, my one target that I want to go after, I can't take them down anymore. Why? Because if I launch too big of an attack, it's going to trip an alarm somewhere and somebody's going to start mitigating it. Or that target is behind some sort of protection and my attack's going to fail. Okay, so they realize that, hey, single vector, single host attacks may not succeed anymore. But what if I launch that same very large attack, but now I target 1,000 IP addresses in the same IP address range for my victim? So now I'm still flooding the network with the same amount of traffic, but I'm doing it across all of these different IP addresses, so it's not tripping any alarms. Now, the system itself and the router and all of these defensive things, they still have to handle all of that overflow of traffic, but it's not triggering alarms to scrub it. So now you have to actually deal with it. You have to figure out, how do you load balance? How do you send this traffic out? How does it work? And if you're not properly configured or set up to do that, those carpet bombing attacks can be extremely effective. So that's essentially what carpet bombing is. And so by the nature of that, I think that speaks to why would an adversary want to use more of that? Well, because they can't get to their individual target anymore. They can't launch a big enough attack to take them down. So let me impact the entire network. That also creates a collateral damage aspect here because every single IP address targeted now is coming under increased load. DNS water torture is a subtype of what we call DNS query floods. This is, I'm going to target a DNS server with as much traffic as I can so that it responds to all these requests such that it can't handle anything else. Or I'm going to overwhelm it so it just stops working. So we actually started to see, well, it's been around since 1997, so we'll put that out there first. But we started to see this increase a little bit more back in 2019, I believe. So in 2019, they started to add new attack vectors and new attack types. I think TCP reflection amplification started to be added here, which is something that we hadn't seen. I'm thinking of carpet bombing on that. The DNS query flood, what was the thing that they added? I think it was the DNS water torture stuff. So different types of DNS query floods. It used to be, let's just throw a bunch of garbage junk traffic at any kind of DNS server on port 53. Port 53 is DNS. But then they started to say, well, that's not sufficient anymore because you can handle loads, you can set rate limiting, you can do all these things. So let's find another way that requires the DNS server to respond to our requests. Enter DNS water torture. So there's two different ways to do DNS water torture. One is what we call pseudo-random label prepending. So let's just say you take the alphabet and you just chuck it at the screen, and whatever order it shows up in, that's your subdomain. So you have all of those letters on there, .example.com. There's no such subdomain as that, but because example.com is legitimate, your DNS server, your authoritative DNS server, has to respond that says, I don't have that subdomain. So that creates an NX domain record. If you get enough of those, the server gets overwhelmed sending those. It can't respond to anything else, and or it might stop working. Those are fairly easy to mitigate because you can create rules that say if there's any kind of randomization here in the subdomains, let's just drop it. So then adversary says, well, okay, if that's not working, let me do dictionary label prepending. So now what they'll do is they'll create legitimate looking subdomains. So an example, sometimes there are websites that might have www2.example.com or www5.example.com. Could be an actual legitimate resource. Many times it's not. But an adversary says, well, let me just go craft a bunch of these. Now I'm going to send a bunch of www2.example.com. It doesn't exist, but any person looking at that with their eye or any kind of what we would consider regular expression to detect the randomization of those things would not see that. So now the server has to respond with NX domains. And again, you overwhelm it. And so between carpet bombing and DNS water torture, DNS query floods, the growth rate is off the charts. If you look at it over 4 or 5 years, I mean, that trend line is up and to the right in a huge way. And we don't anticipate the adversary backing off, because what they realized back in 2019, this was what I was getting at my confusion earlier. In 2019, there was an adversary group out there called Lazarus Bear Armada. They had taken down the New Zealand Stock Exchange by launching attacks. One, they were unprepared. They got prepared by consulting upstream and getting DDoS protections in place. And so the adversary went after that service provider and realized, oh man, they're protected. I can't take them down. So what they did is started to do reconnaissance on the network. And they found out that the authoritative DNS servers that this service provider was using was not protected. So then they started to launch DNS water torture attacks against the authoritative DNS server. And guess what? They once again took the New Zealand Stock Exchange offline for 2 days. But the collateral impact was everybody using that authoritative DNS server was also offline. So then, since then, we have seen this massive rocket ship of these kinds of attacks, because they realized that a lot of service providers, a lot of big enterprises didn't secure their DNS servers. Either they thought they were over provisioned, they didn't think they needed to be secured, they weren't considering the index domain problem, whatever it might be. But there's this huge spate of unprotected DNS servers out there that adversaries realize that, okay, I can't get to my single target anymore. So let me take down the whole network for all of these people. And so that's why we're seeing this huge trend in both carpet bombing and DNS water torture.
So I've learned so much today. There are so many things one doesn't know, clearly because we're not the experts you are. But thank you so much for your time, Richard. It was really, really enlightening, and I'm sure our audience are going to find it very interesting as well.
Absolutely. Again, thanks for having me. I'm always a fan to be on podcasts, and anytime you want to do this again, you know where to find me.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that offer. We'll take you up on it.
All
Thanks.
Right. Thank you.
Thank you so much for being with us. Please do follow us on social media for regular updates and new content.